How many people know about this? Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Well, we all know about the housing bubble in the early 2000s, which burst and led to the great financial crisis. But how many people know that we are in a bigger bubble right now? That's not just my opinion. That's what the data clearly tells us. And the data also tells us that we're seeing this bubble bursting right before our eyes. So in today's video, we're going to look at the data and we're going to interpret what it's telling us. And then we're going to talk about how this relates to Bible prophecy. So let's start with this right here. We've looked at this before. This shows us the median income to median house price ratio. So this is how many times your income or the median income is needed to buy the median priced house. And we see that for many years, this was around 4 to 4.5 in that range. They had a few times in the 70s where it got a little bit lower than 4. But this peaked up at around 6.82 back in the midst of the housing bubble that, again, led straight into the great financial crisis. And we see where we are now. This hit 7.13 and it currently sits at 7.02 according to this chart. I've seen other charts as high as 7.37. But the point is, wherever it's at right now is higher than what we saw at the height of the housing bubble that, again, led us straight into the great financial crisis. But guys, it's not just this chart that's giving us this information. How about this one as well? So this is the Case-Shiller home price to CPI ratio, or consumer price index, right? So this is indexed to inflation. It's taking into account the inflation rate relative to these home prices. And again, we see where we're at now is well over 1, and this peaked at 0.92 back at the peak of the housing bubble right before the great financial crisis. So this is telling us right now we're 10% higher than where we were back then. So the bubble is even bigger. And again, it's not just this. We see more data. We see this from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. This is the S&P CoreLogic Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index. Now, this measures the same properties, the same houses that are sold over time. So it'll take a house that maybe existed back in 1992. What did it sell for in 2002? And then maybe it sold again in 2016, and then it sold again in 2024. What price did it sell for each time? And it tracks this all across the country. And we see we've never seen prices this high before. Now, we would expect that this chart would go upward with inflation. But again, we see from the bottoms of the 1990s, where this baseline was in the 1990s, to the peak is less than where we see from here to where we are now. So again, this says we are in a bubble. Housing prices have never been more unaffordable. And we got this right here, this tweet from Bar Chart. It says U.S. housing market has reached its most unaffordable level in history. It has this chart from Reventure showing U.S. home price history and the bubble territory that we're in now compared to 2006. So we've never seen anything like this. When that last bubble burst, again, it led to massive failures within financial institutions. It led to what we know as the great financial crisis. And now we have a housing bubble that is bigger than that one. We also have this tweet here from Nathan Halberstadt. He says, he shows this chart here, the estimated percentage of 30-year-olds who are both married and homeowners as measured from 1950 to 2025. And we look, this was well over 50% back in the 1950s. And then we've seen this steady decline take place to now where it's probably less around 10% or less of 30-year-olds are married and homeowners. And this is because, well, first off, we're seeing people not get married as much, but we're also seeing that housing is just outright unaffordable. And we had this response here from somebody saying, don't forget the 22% interest rate fiasco in the early 80s. And there were other people in the comments pointing out, well, it's not so bad. You know, we had... this is the fault of people not working hard enough, because back in 1980, interest rates were so high and yet people still afforded houses. But if we go back and we look at these charts, again, back in 1980, you had, it was about 4.4 times your income. Now it's over 7. So it takes 60%. Housing prices are 60% higher than they were in 1980. So that explains this chart right here. Even at higher interest rates. So yes, if interest rates were 18% today instead of what they are today, then housing would be even more unaffordable. But relative to 1980, if you say, well, there were higher interest rates back then and people still afforded houses, right? But if you had the houses today are priced 60% higher than they were back in 1980. That means you would have to put up 60% more for your down payment, and your average monthly payments would be over 55% more. All else being equal, no matter what the interest rate is, if housing is overvalued by 60% more. So guys, this is the state we find ourselves in, where beginning homeowners, they cannot afford housing for the most part. Very few can. You have to be in the elite income earners in order to afford to buy a starter home anymore. It's just impossible. But guys, we are seeing this bubble in the process of bursting. So this says 5-alarm warning for housing market is key crash indicator spikes 17%. It says there's been a dramatic rise in foreclosure filings across the U.S. in the last year, the latest piece of bad news for the housing market. In July through September, there were a total of 101,513 U.S. properties with foreclosure filings, according to the latest report from real estate company Adam. This is a huge 17% rise from the same period in 2024. In September alone, there were 35,602 homes with foreclosure filings across the U.S., up 20% from a year ago. Well, why is that? Well, we read a little bit about that as we scroll down later in the article. It says, Hannah Jones, senior economic research analyst at Realtor.com, added, foreclosure rates in Florida may be relatively high due to some combination of surging insurance premiums, climbing homeowners association fees, and falling buyer demand. Additionally, many homeowners who were protected by pandemic-era forbearance or relief programs are now facing resumed payments they can't afford in light of rising HOA and insurance costs. And guys, this is a big one. We've seen this across the board starting in September, where due to the pandemic and pandemic-era legislation, regulations, that many people were not being foreclosed on that otherwise would have been foreclosed on prior to the pandemic. And so this has artificially suppressed the number of housing units that would have been on the market otherwise. And so as these foreclosures begin to take place, we're going to see inventories rise across the nation. And that is the precursor that you would see prior to price cuts and losses. And we're seeing price cuts on things. So I had this tweet here from Darth Powell. It says, condo price collapse so far by city. This is for year-to-date 2025. And it says the 25 bigger cities with price declines of 12 to 27% through August. Again, this is of condo prices. So we see California, Florida, Texas. Florida shows up in a lot of these. They pointed out, in a lot of cases, insurance premiums are rising for California wildfires, hurricanes in Florida. HOA fees are going up due to inflation, and this is harming the ability of people to continue to live in their houses, even if they have no mortgage. We see this as well. We see this from Google Trends. So this measures search terms that people would look up in Google. And the search term help with mortgage, we see here how it peaked back in March 2009, February, March of 2009. Again, the midst of the great financial crisis. And now we're at an area that far dwarfs that. So this tells you we're in the process of seeing this bubble burst. How about this? We had this tweet from Nick Gurley. He says it would be fair to say that builders have a higher than normal number of empty lots they're sitting on. According to the Census Bureau, there are 105,000 homes listed for sale from builders that they haven't started construction on. There's also 134,000 homes permitted by builders that haven't been started. Both are near records. And look at, so here we are now up near record highs. When was the last record? Up here, back in the housing bubble. Back in 2006, basically 2006, maybe early 2007, where we see this last peak. And we're back to those levels. He goes on, he says the permitted but not yet started metric looks similar. There's 134,000 single-family units that builders have pulled a permit for but haven't started. This is down slightly from the cycle peak and is off from the 2006 high, but is still about 70% above the long-term average. He says, but the reason builders are balking at building these homes is because they aren't going to make as much selling them. According to a graph from News Lambert, builder margins are being compressed, particularly Lennar, whose gross margin on selling houses is down to a 16-year low. So guys, there you have it. We have data across the board telling us that housing has never been more unaffordable in the United States. Relatively speaking, it was cheaper at the height of the bubble, the housing bubble, the 2006 housing bubble that led to the great financial crisis. And now we're seeing this bubble burst across the nation. It starts slowly. It starts in places like Florida, Las Vegas, and then it spreads to the rest of the nation. This is coming. We're seeing, but guys, it's worse this time because we're seeing not only a bubble that's 7 to 10% higher than the peak of what we saw in 2006, but we're seeing that bubble burst alongside a stock market that is at all-time highs. We've never seen overvaluations in the U.S. stock market like we see today. We didn't see it in 1929. We didn't see it at the peak of the dot-com bubble. We didn't see it prior to the great financial crisis. And yet in all those instances, we saw the stock market fall at least 50%. And so we're looking at a great financial crisis lies straight ahead. And again, we've talked about what you should be doing, how you should be preparing for that. Because guys, this is going to lead to rollouts of this digital system that the central bankers and the politicians of the world want to goad everyone into. They want everyone to go into the system so they can slam the door shut and have control. And guys, the infrastructure they're putting in place right now is indistinguishable in capability and function from the system we read about in Revelation chapter 13, verses 16 through 17, the mark of the beast system. Guys, this is just one more sign of how close we are to the tribulation period, to the second coming of Jesus at the end of the tribulation, and of course the rapture of the church before the tribulation occurs. So guys, this tells us we're in the season of the Lord's return. We look at this data along with all the signs Jesus and the prophets told us to look for. And Jesus said, when you begin to see these things, I am right at the door. Guys, Jesus is right at the door. So make sure you're taking advantage of every moment we have left to share the good news with as many people as possible. Plant seeds. Tell people about Jesus. Tell people about these things that we're seeing, these signs that were foretold in the Bible thousands of years ago. Let people know. Plant seeds. You don't have to convert people from unbeliever to believer in 5 minutes. But plant seeds. Do carry out the role God has given you, and know that he will send someone else to water, someone else to tend, and someone else to harvest. Guys, we each need to play our role. Take advantage of every opportunity you have. So guys, let me know what you think. Leave your comments below. God willing, I'll see you on Monday.